Well, welcome. Happy Tu Bishvat. Of course, it is the 15th of the month of Shvat here. And of course, better known if you grew up Jewish, you know, the birthday of the trees, really one of the 4 Jewish New Years. And I'll let the good rabbi tell us a little more about that. I'm sure he'll mention that today. So I just want to say we are so honored to have Rabbi Neril here today with us, who leads an incredible organization. He founded and directs the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development. He raised here in California. He completed a master's and a bachelor's from Stanford University with the focus on global environmental issues and received his rabbinical ordination in Israel. Rabbi Neril is the co-author of a best-selling book, Eco Bible, which I have read, and it's like, I'm really excited. You can buy it in Kindle form, you can buy it in hardcover form, so I really recommend it. And this book, it shines a new light on how the Hebrew Bible, how our Tanakh and great religious thinkers have urged human care and stewardship of nature for many thousands of years, and it's central to spiritual wisdom. He's spoken internationally on religion and the environment, including at the United Nations Environmental Assembly in Nairobi and the Fez Climate Conscience Summit and the Parliament of World Religions. He co-organized 10 interfaith environmental conferences in Jerusalem, New York, Washington, D.C., and Atlanta. And he was just telling me about one that he had here in Los Angeles a year and a half or so ago. He's the lead author on 3 books on Jewish environmental ethics and co-authored 3 reports on faith and ecology courses in theological education. He lives with his wife, Shana, and their 2 children in Yerushalayim. He told me he made Aliyah in 2003. We are so delighted to have you teach us today on, of course, on this holiday dedicated to the environment and to trees and to our world and God's creation of them. So thank you for being with us, Rabbi.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with all of you today. So as Rabbi Eger mentioned, I grew up in California. I went to Temple Isaiah in the Bay Area with Rabbi Roberto Gretz and Rabbi Judy Shanks. And I grew up in the Reform movement in Nifty and made my way to Israel, where I've been living for about 18 years. And first of all, happy Tu Bishvat. It's great to be here with you on Tu Bishvat, the birthday of the trees. I'm going to share with you using my screen share, some slides that relate to a Jewish approach to ecology. And I'll just preface it by saying that I understand that in the past few days, you've had a second in a series of winter storms that closed the grapevine of Highway 5 and brought hail and snow to areas that don't typically see such conditions, including Los Angeles. And that there were even mudslides in Santa Cruz County. And we'll touch a little bit about that in a little bit. So here is, and I'll also say that my organization is active in Los Angeles. And we have a Los Angeles Faith and Ecology Network, which I'd also be happy to share with you a little bit more about as we continue. So here's a screen share of Tu Bishvat and Jewish ecology. And this is in the top right is the Jewish Eco Seminars branch of my organization, which I founded about 10 years ago. So Tu Bishvat is the new year for the trees. In our tradition, as many of you likely know, there are 4 new years for the trees. And Tu Bishvat is one of them, Rosh Hashanah le'ilan. The Mishnah says it's for the tree, which can remind us about the tree of life, Eitz Chaim Hi, which also relates to the Torah as a tree of life, and that the Torah should be a source of life and wisdom that should guide us in our paths. So a man or woman in a kayak, feeling quite cold, decides to make a small fire to keep themselves warm. Within minutes, the kayak has a huge hole in it and sinks to the bottom of the lake, which proves you can't have your kayak and heat it too. I'm going to talk about 8 ships. Since you're there on the Pacific coast, Maybe some of you go on a ship from time to time. When I was about 13, my family went on a 3-day cruise from the port of Los Angeles to Ensenada. It's the only time in my life I've been on a cruise. And so the Midrash says that Rabbi Shimon, the Midrash, the Jewish oral teaching that was written down about 1600 years ago, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai provides an analogy to people who were sitting in a boat. One of them took a borer or a drill and began drilling a hole in the floor of the boat underneath him or her. This person's friend said to him or her, "What are you sitting and doing to the boat?" The person replied to them, "What does it matter to you? Am I not drilling beneath myself?" They said to him or her, "Your actions are of concern to us because the waters are rising through that hole and flooding the entire boat." So many of you have probably heard this teaching. Here's a artistic rendition of it, of where maybe the person was sitting and other people were trying to get the water out of the ship. This cartoon, I think, is a little more to the point, of where the friends say, "Lunkhead, we're all in this boat together. What you're doing affects us too." And then Besofo shel davar, at the end of the day, they all end up in the water. And even the person who drilled it realized that they were correct. And this teaching of Rabbi Shimon is based on 2 verses from the book of Job in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. "So said Job, even if I have erred, my error lodges within me." Job's friends said to him in response, "For he adds rebellion to his error," meaning among us he spoke, meaning you are bringing punishment among us for your sins. That Job thought that his sin would just stay with him, but his friends corrected him and said, "No, your sin also affects us." So I want to open this to a few questions. Why is the person drilling underneath their seat? It's possible to think that the person is crazy or psychotic, but actually the person, the Torah doesn't, Rabbi Shimon doesn't give a reason for why the person's doing this. My father's a psychiatrist. He actually worked in a hospital in LA for a period. And here, it's not schizophrenia that is necessarily the cause of this person's behavior. And so I want you to think for a moment, can you think of a rational reason for why this person is drilling underneath their own seat? And if you have an idea, then please unmute yourself and suggest a response.
Well, what comes to my mind is perhaps they're trying to go fishing underneath their boat. They're trying to interact with the water beneath them in a way that they might have other ways to do, but they might be thinking that's a good way to do it.
Amazing. Rabbi Chaikin, you and I are on the same wavelength. Maybe they want to fish. They can't drop a line on outside of it, the ship, and so they try to do it underneath their own seat. Other ideas?
They found some way to monetize it. Maybe they can pull out the salt water, but it's right underneath them. So with the tube, it's only underneath them, and they have a little how to make it fresh water or something like that. But just they want to make money for profit.
Amazing. Maybe they want to desalinate the water, and they have a little desalination device that they brought on the ship, and they can both sell the salt and the water, the fresh water. Wow. I've taught this a few times before, but I've never, that's a novel idea. Amazing.
I have one. If the person saw a fish going underneath and is selfish, might think, "Oh, if I reach down, only I'll have the fish." And maybe no one else will notice that there's a fish there.
Okay, it's definitely a possibility. So a few other ideas, or maybe the person wants to cool down their feet, that it's hot on the bottom of the ship and they want to cool down their feet. Another idea is to drink fresh drinking water, that maybe they're on a freshwater body of water, Lake Tahoe. Or perhaps they want to drill for oil or other non-renewable resources. As you know, LA has a long oil industry. When I was in college, I took a course on the history of California's economy, and they talked about the oil development in California, which actually, interestingly enough, it was California oil companies that funded the oil exploration in Saudi Arabia, the San Francisco Oil Company, the Berkeley Oil Company, among others. And I grew up on an acre of land in Lafayette, California, and there was actually oil that was, they were drilling for oil on my street around 1900, but they didn't find any. Would have been, otherwise I wouldn't have lived on that street. So maybe they want to harvest seaweed to go with the fish. Maybe they brought some rice along with them to make sushi. Or perhaps they simply need to go to the bathroom. And in order to go to the bathroom, they don't have another way to do it. So they are drilling underneath their own seat. So I want to ask you a second question, which is, what accounts for the disregard of other people's welfare? In other words, why does the person only think about themselves? Why don't they have concern for the other people on the ship? Any ideas?
Yes, the idea that it's a zero-sum game. And the more you get, the less I get.
Okay, so perhaps it's a zero-sum game. Great. Other ideas?
They're sociopaths and have no empathy.
Well, okay. So I like the no empathy part, that perhaps they just don't care about what, they just don't care. They're sort of living in their own bubble, and in that bubble, it's all about me. Could be. Other ideas?
Or just simply unaware that what they're doing does have a negative effect on anyone else.
Good. So maybe they just aren't aware, for example, maybe they think that a small hole won't cause real damage. It's just a small hole. It's not going to sink the ship. Or maybe they think that they can't think about anything beyond their immediate need. That's essentially, they're very thirsty. They're very hungry. They have to go to the bathroom badly. And that's all that matters in the here and now, without regard to the future. Or perhaps they think the problem is long-term. If the ship sinks, it won't happen for a long time, and therefore they'll be off the ship and it doesn't really matter. I'll ask you a third question. What can the people on the ship do to convince this person to change his or her behavior? Or to put it differently, short of tying the person up or throwing them overboard, what can the people on the ship do to verbally tell them to stop doing what they're doing?
Well, it can make him aware of the harm that he is causing to them, to other people. If he's simply not aware of it, then that would be a first step.
Okay, great. To increase that person's level of awareness. Other ideas? Okay, so one thing that comes to me is that they can meet the person's needs in a way that doesn't involve drilling. For those who have read Marshall Rosenberg's Nonviolent Communication, you may be aware of how we have different strategies to meet our needs. And so one strategy is to drill underneath the seat. Another strategy would be to simply give the person food, or to ask what they need and then to meet that need in a different way. Another possibility is they can explain that the person's action will harm themselves too, that person's in the ship. Or they could tell the person their action impacts other people and that they should care about other people because there are other people on the ship. So that's...
Rabbi, I wonder, in this case, the first one you said was that meet their need meet their need another way, right? And one light bulb that's popping into my head is the idea from one of my undergraduate economics courses that you could pay the person, right? If their incentive to drill is to fish and sell fish, right? You could actually pay them not to drill, right? So that you could use certain, that's another way of meeting the need, I guess, right? Is to incentivize them otherwise.
Amazing. You definitely could. It's funny because I earlier today I was teaching a class to a group of Hillel students in the Midwest, and each Hillel student who came to the class received $5 to go to what they call Cafe Sababa. So they incentivized coming to hear the class, because perhaps otherwise there wouldn't have been anyone there. And so thank you all for joining this evening, this morning, your time. So that's ship number one. And as I said, I want to talk about 8 ships in the next half hour or so. Ship number 2 is Noah's Ark, which you're all likely familiar with. According to the Midrash, in the top deck of the Ark, Noah and his family lived because God said to build the Ark with 3 decks. In the middle deck of the Ark, that's where the animals lived. Miraculously, 8 million animals lived there, and they didn't eat each other because God told animals in the first chapter of Genesis to eat plants, and God told people to eat plants, and it was so. And only after the flood were people and animals allowed to eat each other. And the lion lay down with the lamb. Life did not take life to sustain life. Here in the bottom of the ship, according to the Midrash, the oral tradition, Noah and his family would take the excrement from their own and from the animals and bring it to the bottom deck. Why did they do that? So an ecological reading would be because Noah and his family didn't want to throw it overboard, even though the world was going to pot, but they cared about the fish that were still alive in the ocean. A second possibility is that the Torah says that one of the first things Noah did when he left the ark was he planted a vineyard. And we know with flooding, a lot of the topsoil gets washed away. That's an issue now with mudslides after the big fires in California. And so therefore, the manure that they saved for the year they were on the ark could have served as fertilizer for them. That's an ecological reading. And that's, as Rabbi Igor mentioned in one of the commentaries in Eco Bible, which we published a few months ago and have actually, we printed 400 copies in LA with an ecological printer, design printing, and we distributed it to clergy in LA and beyond. So a second aspect of Noah's Ark, which animal was Noah distrustful of? The cheetah, because it might cheat him. Why didn't Noah go fishing? Because there were only 2 worms, and he didn't want to kill off the worms when we needed worms to reproduce to aerate the soil after the flood. What did the people of Noah's generation do to trigger God to destroy almost all life on earth? This is the only time in the Torah where God says that God will destroy almost all life. And it's very surprising because at the end of the first Torah portion in the Torah, of the portion of Bereshit, Genesis, it says that God reconsidered and God decided to destroy the world. So according to the Midrash, there's a story about someone stealing a peanut at the market. And if you've been to Israel and can imagine the Machane Yehuda market here in Jerusalem, someone goes up to a vendor and takes a peanut. The truth is, when I was a kid, I used to go to Safeway and eat a gummy worm. In our times, the gummy worms probably cost 50 cents. Back then, they probably cost 5 cents. So according to the Midrash, the vendor would call the police and the police would come, but the officer would say, look, a peanut is worth less than a penny, and therefore I can't prosecute the person because the law system doesn't allow me to arrest the person or even fine them for stealing such a tiny thing. But everyone would do that. Everyone would steal a peanut and the society couldn't function. And God said, this isn't why I created the world, so I'm going to destroy humanity and all species with it. So that's essentially when people accustom themselves to doing small acts of evil in the aggregate, it didn't work for humanity to continue to exist. It wasn't sustainable. Ship number 3 is Jonah and the repentance of Nineveh. As many of you recall in the story, which is in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, and it's also read on Yom Kippur in many synagogues, Jonah was told by God to go to the city of Nineveh, which is in Iraq today, to go from Israel and to prophecy to tell the people that they were being sinful. If they didn't repent from whatever their sins were, then they would be destroyed by God. And Jonah didn't want to fulfill that prophecy, so he went on a ship in the Mediterranean, and God brought a storm. And here in this picture, Jonah tells the fellow sailors to throw him overboard because the storm is his fault, and they do that, and he ends up in the belly of a whale. Now, which animal has the largest brain of any animal in the world? What's your guess? Okay, a lot of people think the biggest brain of an animal is obviously the human.
Whale.
But no,
Well,
the sperm whale beats us. It also happens to be a much larger animal than us. I imagine its brain is somewhere over here. It also has this large frontal area, which I am not actually sure what that is. Purpose is perhaps to get the brine. And so Jonah goes from a place of small-mindedness to large-mindedness, while in the belly of the animal with the largest brain, perhaps in its belly, it also has some brain cells like we do. And Jonah says that he's going to do the mission that God asked him to do in prophecy to Nineveh. And so Jonah shows up in Nineveh. And the question is, what did he say to the people in the leadership? How did he say it to inspire them to change? Or to put it differently, why did the people of Nineveh change course? So there's another midrash which says that in our Torah portion, Parshat Beshalach, that is read this week in synagogues, Pharaoh survived the splitting of the sea. He was the only person from the Egyptian army to survive, and he went back to Egypt, where Egypt was in ruins and probably was deposed, and then traveled to Iraq, where he became the king somehow. And then Jonah shows up in Nineveh and says, knock, 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 Pharaoh. Pharaoh, I have a message from God that if you don't repent of your sinful ways, then God will destroy your city. And Pharaoh has fresh in his memory what it meant when a different prophet or prophets, Moses and Aaron, knocked on his door and said, let my people go or else. And so Pharaoh immediately, he looks Jonah in the eye, and he tells his advisors and his people that they needed to repent, and they did so, and God didn't destroy the city of Nineveh. So that's an example in the Torah of tshuva, of repentance, and of doing something quickly that when they see a problem ahead and see God's hand in it, that they're motivated to change. Ship number 4 is the Titanic. And you're all familiar with the movie with Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio, actually, since you're in LA and West Hollywood, perhaps. I don't know where it was filmed, but maybe some of it was even filmed in some of the studios that are near you. I have some close friends who work in Hollywood, so Captain Smith was warned about icebergs ahead, so why did he sail full steam ahead? Right? I believe that this is Captain Smith right here with the decorated captain. He was a very experienced, one of the most veteran captains, and he was therefore tasked with the maiden voyage of the world's largest ship. So let me actually just open that up. Why do you think that he didn't slow down or stop when he was warned by 11 ships, including the LSS California? The ship California radioed or sent a telegram to the Titanic the day before saying, there's icebergs ahead, be careful.
Perhaps he thought he was invincible.
That he was invincible. Okay, good. Other ideas?
Yeah, he thought he was smarter than everyone else, and his ship was stronger and could defeat any iceberg.
Good. That essentially that he could defeat any iceberg. So he didn't. He also didn't expect there to be icebergs in that part of the North Atlantic in mid-April. Just like you wouldn't expect it to snow in Los Angeles, even though it's the winter, but you usually don't get snow on the 24th of January in Los Angeles. However, in 1912, that was the most intense winter in that area in 30 years. And there was actually an ice pack 100 miles long and 100 miles wide, which he sailed right into. So it was actually inevitable he'd hit an iceberg if he did that without in the nighttime when they couldn't see them. The Titanic also had an equivalence of 46,000 horsepower. So it's an apt metaphor for empowering industrial society. And when you have the engines running at 46,000 horsepower, you can't just sort of pull the reins on the horses. They had to reverse the engines, and that took a number of minutes. By comparison, Air Force One has 240,000 horsepower engine. He also thought the ship was unsinkable based on the belief that industrial society is stronger than nature. And here's a glorious portrait of the ship, the new White Star Liner RMS Titanic. And it's a toilet soap advertisement for it. Captain Smith also thought he'd be able to avoid a collision in time, yet they only had 35 seconds after spotting the iceberg to turn. It's interesting because the ship was made in Belfast, Ireland, and when they left after the ship was built, Captain Smith didn't do a steering test to see what the steering radius was of the ship because they were so confident, overconfident about the capabilities of the ship. People on board also assumed that the captain was taking care of them, but in fact, the philanthropists, some of the wealthiest people in Europe, put on a dinner in his honor that night, and he was actually consuming prime rib and cocktails 2 hours before they hit the iceberg, and then he went to sleep only to be woken up by his ship crashing into an iceberg. And I'll also just say that according to scientists who study the ships, that had they hit it full straight on, they might have survived. But they in those 35 seconds, the second lieutenant turned the ship, and so they hit the iceberg in a glancing blow and punctured 9 of the 16 bulkheads or watertight compartments. And the ship was only designed to survive if 6 of the 16 were punctured. So they had a lot of bad luck. Why the need for speed? So the desire for speed in the Atlantic passenger ship business is similar to the airline business today. If you take off at LAX or Burbank or Long Beach, then the captain says, we're gonna, and you're flying to Newark, we're gonna, push it a little bit on the engines, and we'll get you there, before the expected arrival time. We'll fly a little faster. So too with that, they were trying to make time and make speed. Also with the Boeing 737 MAX 8, that Boeing didn't want Airbus to steal market share. And so therefore they sped the development process. This is me on the tarmac in Tel Aviv a year and a half ago when I boarded an Ethiopian Airlines Boeing 737 MAX 8. On the day that the one crashed, I was flying from Tel Aviv to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and then Addis Ababa to Nairobi. So I was on the flight after the one that crashed. And I say that to you first of all. I feel God's providence. I feel God's blessing that I'm able to be here with you, and also that Ethiopian Airlines, the flight was part of the problem with the 737 MAX 8 was that they were speeding the process. Also with the BP oil spill, Halliburton, BP, and Transocean were rushing to meet a deadline for the development of the Macondo well, drilling 35,000 feet below the surface of the seabed. And in their rush, a big gusher came up and caused the biggest oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Just as the Titanic hit an iceberg that was 90% below their perception, so too in our current crisis, we only see the surface of the problem: fossil fuels, climate change, and more. Or the surface being the extreme weather that you just had, or the fires that you've had. Those are the symptoms of the problem. Those are not actually the problems. The ecological crisis is not a crisis of the birds and the bees or the trees and the toads. It's a crisis of how we live as spiritual beings in a physical reality. And the underlying issues are much deeper: greed, apathy, arrogance, and instant self-gratification. Dr. Gus Speth, the former dean of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, said that he thought that 30 years of good science on ecology would solve the problem. But he realized he was wrong, because the problem is not a problem of ecology. Those are just the symptoms. The problem is a spiritual problem, and scientists don't know how to deal with that. There's an anthropologist at UCLA, Jared Diamond, who wrote a very powerful book called Collapse, about 20 societies, 10 of them that deforested their land and made their land too salty, and as a result collapsed, including one to the east of you in Chaco Canyon in what's Arizona, New Mexico, as well as talks about the Mayan society. And then he talks about 10 societies that succeeded, that they saw the sustainability challenges coming, especially relating to deforestation and salinization of the farmland. And then they changed course. So he's actually a leading ecological voice right there in LA. The Titanic sailing, hitting the iceberg, now sitting at the bottom of the sea, and it's where it's been for 109 years. Ship number 5, planet Earth. So we can conceive of planet Earth as a ship, not only because it's 70% water, and the land is sort of floating on the water. That's actually a literal understanding, but we could think about the atmosphere as the bottom of the ship. And here's a graph of global carbon emissions from 1900, when my grandparents were born, at about 500 million metric tons of carbon. In our times, it's in excess of 10,000, because this is actually only until 2010, every year that humanity puts into the atmosphere. Airlines flew more than 4.3 billion passengers in 2018, which is up from fewer than 500 million 2 decades earlier. So passenger travel increased over 800% in 20 years. For the elders on this session, you might remember that in the 50s, people used to dress up when they would go on an airplane. It was like a big deal to get on an airplane, whereas in our times, it's for many people, it's something they would, they do it so frequently that they don't enjoy it. I have a cousin who lives in the Valley and works in sales. He said to me, traveling every week gets very old very fast. But many people have to do that for their jobs. And so here you can see in this graph that in the US, carbon emissions per capita are the highest, at about close to 20 metric tons per year per person. In the EU, it's at about 8, in Middle East about 6, and Africa at about 2. So the average person in the US has about 10 times the per capita CO2 emissions. Just in LA, many people have cars, and whereas in Africa, most people don't have cars. So that's one significant difference. Conservative science. When I was living in California in 1993, I read for the first time about climate change in a New York Times article, which had me shaking in my boots. But the nice thing about it is they said this was only going to happen in 2100. Climate change was really going to show up in 100 years. But the computer models have actually been too conservative, because they didn't have the data for what's actually happening. And so what's happened in California in the past couple of years with the fires, what happened in Australia, and the burning of the boreal forests in Canada and Russia, that was supposed to show up in 2100, but it's now showing up now. And also conservative philanthropy. Larry Kramer, who's the president of the Hewlett Foundation, said about 2% of total philanthropic giving for a problem that is unquestionably the single largest challenge facing humanity is crazy. That, the Getty Museum is well funded, and at the same time, the universities are well funded, the hospitals are well funded. There's a lot of philanthropic donations to a lot of important causes, but if you don't address climate change and sustainability, then the other efforts are going to be subsumed by that. We've essentially created a series of icebergs that we're colliding with year after year, whether it's the desertification whether it's flooding and we're all drilling small holes on the collective ship. So to sort of bring things full circle, and Rabbi Shimon's metaphor of a person drilling on a ship, so now we can understand it a little bit in a deeper way, because each of us is doing the same thing. We are that person. We are on that ship that is the earth, and we all have our rational reasons, whether it's to turn on a light bulb or to drive somewhere, or to take a flight, or to eat meat. And we're not crazy, but in the aggregate, humanity doing this, 8 billion people doing this, is crazy. We're both rational and crazy at the same time. And what's amazing is that we have an addiction that it's very difficult for us to stop. I was actually on a call recently with someone. My organization has a faith and ecology network in Los Angeles, and they were mentioning how many religious congregations in the LA area, a number of them receive support from donors in the fossil fuel industry, and therefore ecology is never talked about by the clergy. And that surprised me, because I hadn't heard that. So we're essentially drilling on the ship through our daily consumption. How can people act now to avert danger in the future? So that leads me to ship number 6, which is the Mississippi River. A year and a half ago, there were 100-year flood, which is the 100-year floods are now showing up not every 100 years, but much more frequently. And the barge traffic shut down because they couldn't navigate on the river. It was too fast. And so this is an example of how climate change also affects the shipping industry and delivering of fertilizer to farmers. In Houston, they flooded 3 times in 3 years. And a young girl was in the house with her father, and all of a sudden the water gets up to her neck. Now, in our tradition, in this week's Torah portion, there's Nachshon, who is living. He sees the Egyptian army on one side, and he goes into the Red Sea, and suddenly the water parts. And that's maybe familiar with the Midrash that he said, Mi chamocha, who is like you, God? And then he said, and as the water gets up to his mouth, he says, Mi kamocha. He can't say it fully, and then the water splits for him. In this case, there's a story of a young girl who saw the water reaching up to the neck of her and her father in their flooded house in Houston, and she saw her father crying. And she looked at her father, and because her whole life she's seen her father as this authority figure, everything's under control, hakol beseder, don't worry. And at that moment, he wasn't in control. He'd lost control, and at some level, I think that people have a lot of faith in that it's essentially going to be okay. The world we live in is going to be the same world as it's been for our whole life. And Rabbi Eger was sharing with me earlier that when she was growing up, you could always count on LA being 72 degrees. But now there's a huge fluctuation in the temperature, including 126 degrees. There was a great sign. There was a great photo from the heat wave in LA this past summer of a church that had a thermometer that said like 123 degrees. And it was like a Calvary Baptist church, and here in Jerusalem it was 109 degrees, which isn't 126, but Jerusalem's never been 109 degrees before, and elsewhere in Israel it was in the 120s. So it's and actually Israel and California are both Mediterranean climates. There's 6 places in the world that are Mediterranean climates, and so we're 2 of them. Ship number 7 is Greta's solar ship and young people's awakening. So as you know, Greta Thunberg sailed on a solar ship from Europe to the US, and then spoke at the UN climate negotiations. She's helped inspire a movement of young people who are saying, I don't really care so deeply about religion. The Torah that's been presented to me isn't really speaking to me in such a deep way, but I will skip school on Friday to go protest so that we can have a sustainable planet. And a lot of young people care more about sustainability than they do about religion. And so, that's also something to take note of. But a lot of the young people are also saying to the older generation, look, don't betray me. The older generation has much more power than the younger generation. But we feel it. And there's something about being young where, I see this with my kids. It's like, or there's something about growing older that I think numbs a person a little bit to reality. And so the young people in particular are really speaking up and saying, we need to do something now. The last ship I'll mention is the soul. The Zohar, the mystical tradition, talks about how the soul is a ship, which is essentially it's sailing on the waters of this world. And it's in a body, it's in this world, and it's trying to go in a certain direction and to navigate a storm, navigate difficult waters. And that's our situation, that religious teachers, I believe, can help us to think long-term, moderate consumption, and find greater pleasure in the spiritual and communal. I think religion is a key source of inspiration on this topic, but the question is, are rabbis and other clergy making enough effort to teach on this topic? And of all denominations, I'm not picking on anyone here. And according to research, no, and it's actually not just about rabbis, it's really about clergy in every religion, that many people think that religion is one thing and ecology is another thing, and never do the two meet. It also doesn't help that most rabbis and other clergy never study deeply about ecological sustainability in their training programs, or at least in many of them. It's not a core part of the curriculum, so many of them don't feel comfortable speaking on it. And obviously I'm not pointing any fingers, and I actually applaud Rabbi Eger and Rabbi Shakin for having me speak here. And it's amazing that you're raising this topic as an important one for your congregation. So my organization, the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development, is working on seminary engagement. We held a conference in Los Angeles a year and a half ago at the Brandeis Bardeen Institute for about 75 faculty and deans of seminaries and rabbinical schools. The conference was actually almost canceled because there was a fire near Simi Valley, near the Reagan Library, and which also was affecting power because they turned off the power in that area. And so our backup plan was to do the conference at AJU's main campus near, Mulholland Drive, but there was a fire there as well, and which also closed the campus. Baruch Hashem, praise to God, we ended up holding the conference. It was a success. And we're continuing to engage clergy and in green teams in Los Angeles with a Los Angeles Faith and Ecology network. So we're also working on a faith-inspired renewable energy project in Africa. This is a solar field in Rwanda that the company Gigawatt Global built. We're collaborating with Gigawatt Global and the Anglican Church in Africa to develop a commercial scale solar field on church land in Mozambique. Trying to bring religion and ecology in a practical way. Spiritual satisfaction, moderating consumption, these are two of the core roots of the issue. Also altruism, and being net givers instead of net takers. Studies show that an act of giving can activate the area of the brain associated with positive feelings. And so what can we do at a personal level? So here's 5 practical suggestions. Compost. A lot of our waste is organic waste that can be composted. Second is to decrease meat and dairy and egg consumption. If you don't want to go cold turkey, then you can at least be a reducitarian. Reduce the amount of meat or dairy or eggs that you eat. Some people eat it at every meal or multiple servings at every meal. I was in California a couple of years ago, and I had a meal with someone, and his meal consisted of a big slice of goat and a bowl of cottage cheese, which was like, wow, like it was like 100% animal product, but it was like 4 servings. It's over the top. Our ancestors didn't eat this much animal products, and they also didn't have the same issues that of obesity that comes from eating such a high amount of animal products. Decreasing air travel, which during the pandemic is easier, but even when the pandemic is over, to really rethink the $99 ticket to Acapulco or Puerto Vallarta. It's so easy to do, but the carbon stays in the atmosphere for 100 years from an airplane. We can also buy in bulk. That reduces the packaging, and reuse and reduce. Essentially, Earth to humanity, shape up or ship out. Don't take the slow boat to China. Winning too slow on climate is losing. We're all on the same boat. We need all hands on deck, especially the 6 billion people that identify with religion. And we can't trust that the captain of the ship is really has our best interest in mind, because these 5 captains were promoting fossil fuels quite actively, including the Prime Minister of Canada, surprisingly, promoting tar sands. The question is not, did my actions change the world? The question is, did I do everything in my power when everything was at stake? And even if, you know, we're going to achieve green jobs and clean water and clean air, that we need to prioritize our efforts, or else our other efforts could go down the holes in the ship that are the holes in the bucket, like that are our ecological challenges. And I'll just finish with a story and then open for questions and comments. The Nobel laureate Toni Morrison said about a young boy who comes to an elder woman with a bird in his hands, and he says to the woman, "Can you tell me whether the bird in my hands is alive or dead?" And she thinks to herself for a minute, and she realizes that the boy is playing a trick on her, because if she says the bird is dead, he'll open his hands and the bird will fly away. And if she says the bird is alive, then he'll close his hands and crush the bird. And either way, she's wrong. He's got her coming and going. So she thinks to herself for a minute, and she says to the young boy, "I don't know whether the bird in your hands is alive or dead. All I know is that the life of the bird is in your hands." And so my blessing to us, this Tu Bishvat, this new year of the trees, is that we really go deep into our tradition, which is so rich in ecological wisdom, and that we use that to find a path forward for a thriving, spiritually aware, and sustainable society. Thank you. Please, if you have questions.
So beautiful, so heart and soul filling to remind us on this particular holiday and time marking in our Jewish calendar that we really need to be reminded of redoubling our efforts in this time of climate disaster that's happening in everywhere across our globe. So we want to open up want you to open up of comments, questions for the rabbi about this, sharing some experiences. We want to be able to do that now.
Okay, I'll start.
Great.
When my son was in Hebrew school about 20 or 30 years ago, it was an annual tradition to plant trees with the temple. And I haven't seen that lately as an annual ritual. Is that an important enough activity that would, you know, when you talk about prioritizing what you can do, where does that fit into what you recommend?
So it's a good question. You know, tree planting is definitely a great practice, and especially with Tu Bishvat. So if you can plant, if you have your own land and you can plant a tree there, that's an amazing thing to do. And if not, then you can give donations to organizations that do tree planting. There's an effort in Africa called the Great Green Wall Initiative to make a 1 billion tree forest in the Sahel region, which is in sub-Saharan Africa, right below the Sahara, where there's increased desertification. And there's different organizations that are promoting massive tree planting as one way of trying to curb climate change.
Well, we have tree people here in Los Angeles, and they do things like that, both, you know, as group activities and politically. But what I mean is I haven't seen the push to have groups of people plant trees the way I did 30 years ago when he was young. And I don't know if that's the kind of activity that your Los Angeles group coordinates or something like that. Because I miss going to plant trees.
So those, I'm sure that those activities exist in Los Angeles, and then tree people would probably be a good place to
I would add though, Lynn, that I think one of the things that I hear about more so are some of the things that Rabbi Neril mentioned and that we can be focused on in our personal choices, because those small choices, right? Each extra meal that we have, that we eat meat or dairy, each extra minute or two we take in the shower, right? These are the little choices that that for each one of us may not feel like huge choices, but because that's the micro choice that brings to the aggregate, has a major impact. That I do hear, I think, especially around water issues here in Southern California, I hear a lot of focus on keeping our showers short, keeping our our if you're a homeowner, making sure that your lawn and your landscaping is water friendly and dry climate friendly, things like that.
Great, thank you. Other comments, questions about anything we learned today or future activities? It's hard to see.
Yeah, I think
Hi,
the whole
Robert.
issue of methane from cattle and dairy production probably doesn't get enough play. And I really love that, Rabbi Neril, you made a point, but I would urge everyone, including you, to maybe emphasize that even more, because the less cattle and dairy production there is in the US, let alone the world, the more rapid impact we can have on global warming.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely in agreement with you about that. And it's interesting because Robert and I both, Robert was at Temple Isaiah in California in Lafayette. So I agree with you. And, methane from cows, cows have this amazing ability to eat grass and to live off of grass, which we can't do. But the reason they can do that is because they have multiple stomachs and they chew their cud, so they reprocess that. But in the process, they have bacteria in their gut, which produces methane. And so they have a significant amount of gas, and methane is 30 times stronger in causing climate change than carbon dioxide. And so dairy and beef is a significant driver of global climate change. Yeah.
And California is a big producer of beef and dairy and cheese. It's very much a part of the economic relationship here in California, and so it's important to think about that. How all of these things are interacted. And so when we talk about green economy, we're not just talking about reduction of fossil fuels or relying on solar power or wind power. We're also talking about rethinking how agriculture and how a state does its agriculture on a global level. And so these are really critical issues and important policy issues as we think about being green, how that impacts how we vote, what we demand from our legislators in the state of California as well. It's not really just about thinking about recycling. There's a larger policy impact issues. Mm-hmm. Although recycling is really important. I don't want to undercut how important that is. But there are also these larger policy issues to make these kind of, I think, systemic changes that you're talking about, Rabbi. Correct?
Yeah, and that you're pointing to something very important, that a lot of people think that ecology or sustainability is about recycling. That as long as you recycle, you're a card-carrying environmentalist. But really, that's the tip of the iceberg. It's like, to be a Jew, it's more than just being able to say shalom. Yeah, there's a lot more in the path. And so what we put into our bodies, how we move ourselves, transportation, how we vote, these are all significant issues that relate to sustainability.
Well, I'm so grateful for your raising these issues and raising our awareness, and particularly the Jewish underpinnings of it, because we don't, we think about the environment here and we don't always think about the deep connections to the life of the spirit within our Jewish teachings that undergird this. I mean, the truth is the menorah, this most ancient symbol of the Jewish people, is really a stylized tree. And based on the stylized almond tree, almond blossoming, and Moses' staff and Aaron's staff were blossoming almonds. And this holiday of Tu Bishvat is really timed to the blossoming of the almond trees. And so even as we think about the most ancient symbol of the Jewish people, the menorah, we are really truly reminded about our connection to the earth, our need to be rooted in earth-centric values and earth-centric thinking, and how we take care, as you said, Rabbi, about our stewardship of our planet. So thank you so very much for really enlightening Torah learning and an enlightening, thoughtful presentation about how we should do that. And if anybody makes a donation to Congregation Kol Ami today, and thank you to the rabbis presentation, we will match that donation to his organization, to the Interfaith Center. So, we don't charge for any of these programs. So please, if you make a donation to the Congregation Kol Ami, we'll match that donation again with a donation to his organization, the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development. Just a quick reminder to everybody, tomorrow, Cantor Patty Linsky joins us for Shabbat Shirah tomorrow night online, and Saturday morning, Alden Solovi from Yerushalayim will be with us on Shabbat morning, reading from his new Jewish book, This Precious Life, as poetry and prayers. Saturday night, deadline's Friday though at noon for the escape room online in Havdalah. But you have to register by noon on Friday, right,
Tomorrow,
Rabbi
yeah,
Chaikin?
noon tomorrow.
Tomorrow, but it should be really fun and great way to have Havdalah together on Saturday night. What time is that at 7?
6:30 will be
6:30.
Havdalah, and the escape room will start probably a little closer to the 7, but
Right.
join us for
You don't-
Havdalah at 6:30.
You don't have to be in a team. We're going to put you in a team. So lots more. Happy Tu Bishvat, everybody. Again, thank you, Rabbi Neril, for being with us. And we didn't really welcome a Pesach. Are you here? Are you still here? Is Pesach still here? Oh, there.
Hello. I am.
You're our local
I'm
LA person. So everybody say hi to Pesach. Hopefully we'll be in touch with you too soon and get
That sounds great.
deeper
I'll look
connected.
forward to
I'll be
it.
in touch with you. All right. So Kol Ami can go to the next level here. All right.
Love it. Sounds
All
great.
right. Thank you for being with
Thanks,
us,
everyone.
everybody. Happy Tu Bishvat. Thank you, Rabbi. Get some
You're
sleep.
welcome. Thank you. All the best. Tu Bishvat Sameach.
Yes. Tu
Bishvat
Bishvat.
Bishvat Sameach to everyone.
Bye.